CO2 emissions and temperature rise rightly get a lot of our attention. But pollution, biodiversity loss and the destruction of our natural world is moving at a runaway pace. I've been facing up to a realisation that not only are we in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, but humans are very much on the list.
Very, very few people are looking at it directly. And even those who sort of are seeing the evidence and seeing, kind of becoming a little concerned, they're still having a hard time going the full distance with it. Even people who, you'll read them or watch a movie that they've done and it'll go almost there, but then there's this holdout for some sort of hope or some kind of fantasy green technology that might save us, or on and on. We all have seen this who are talking about these matters in this way. It's almost like people staring at Magellan's ships and not really understanding, not even seeing them, right? That's the apocryphal story.
When Jem Bendel's paper, Deep Adaptation, came out in 2018, it not only had a big impact on me, but it had also sparked a whole movement by that name. But I also know you had a really hard time publishing that. It wasn't simple for you. Could you just talk about what process you went through to get that out there?
So I wrote it, but I felt that I couldn't do it unless I fully expressed the truth as I saw it. So I wasn't surprised when the anonymous reviewers, that's the process for peer review, came back and they said, there's lots of good things in here, but it's not appropriate for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons was that you should not be concluding that it's too late to stop catastrophic climate change. And also that's going to be quite troubling for the readers. I couldn't, and the request to change it to make it suitable for publication would have stripped it of the emotion and also my own conclusion, which is that this isn't in doubt now. The only way one can say it's in doubt is if one chooses to stick to certain sort of a paradigm of knowledge that we can never be exactly certain about anything in the future. But I realize that gives you some kind of psychological, emotional escape. Say, oh, well, this might not be the case. Oh, we can't be absolutely certain. And that kind of helps you calm down. And I thought, well, that's not my truth. I mean, to me, this is certain now. And it opens up a whole new set of questions once you decide that it's certain that climate is going to really ruin our way of life. I'm encouraging us to think about what it might mean for local government and national government to start to get ready.
I could also feel this growing urgency to get ready for the days ahead, both practically and emotionally. But in order to do so as a world community, we have to start accepting the science and acting as if it's real. Yet in doing just that, it seems to come with this label of being a doomer.
People do not need a fairy tale future, a story of a fairy tale future in order to be motivated. We've seen that with the explosion of Extinction Rebellion around the world. They're very clear that we are in a dreadful, perilous situation and we must do all that we can to give ourselves a better chance. I think the argument that this is somehow going to lead to apathy, despair or depression and not engagement on the agenda to cut carbon or draw down carbon, I think is just wrong. And there's also environmental psychology published to show that's wrong as well. It's that if somebody feels that climate change is now and it's close to home, they're way more likely to do something about it than if it's somewhere in the future affecting somewhere else, somewhere hot and poorer than where they're living.
It's too late to change this system. We have to be brave enough to admit to ourselves that we have to have a different kind of conversation about what to do next, even if it feels like we have no idea what that means. We have to be brave enough to start that conversation.
Yes, it's very scary, and it brings up a lot of despair and a lot of feelings of hopelessness. So is it not our job as adults to process through that, understand that, and now then ask some of the deeper, harder questions of okay, so now what am I really going to do? And how then shall we live?
But that sadness and that grief and how to live with that, maybe even transform that, that's what people need to learn from Indigenous. People are listening to Native people now because their world is in danger, okay? They're saying this is the end of life as we know it, so on and so forth. This is something that Native people have been dealing with ever since the colonists came. That has to do with a relationship to the land, to the universe, to community. It's really alien. And our struggle as Native people today, because we're so influenced by colonial culture, that it's hard for us to inhabit that. And we need our ceremonies to inhabit that pre-contact experience.
It wasn't just the Native Americans that had been through this. Western culture has been built on it. Best economic practice and protecting our way of life has meant doing whatever we need to whoever or whatever we need to keep this party going. It's so hard to look at this. I am part of this culture and have benefited from the profits of this past and still live in the privilege of its actions and its relentless procession.
Guilt is simply a human emotion. And for me, when I see a newcomer or a colonial person feeling guilt for what their forefathers did, I think it's a good sign, okay? So I think it's good to begin to tie into that. And of course, when you see all this destruction, the first thought is, oh my God, what happened here? Well, you have to answer that. You have to go in and say, well, what created this? What is this type of thinking?
Part of me goes to this not liking myself as a human or some disgust with humanity that we might have done this.
The Native thought is we were born into the garden, so to speak. We were born into heaven. You guys were kicked out of heaven. Right?
Yeah,
that's right. The myth, okay? So
Yes.
that's the story. So if you're kind of living with that story your whole life, of course you're going to be in self-loathing. That's the part where the guilt comes in. And those kind of myths, ideologies that make us fallen by nature, that make us aliens that don't know how to live here. It's not human beings that have made things colossally dire. It's a particular type of thinking. It's a predatory type of thinking. Jack Forbes calls it the wetiko, which means cannibal. Because that predatory psychology is completely justified as being the natural state of man. Mm-hmm. And that's where the guilt comes from, because it's not true. Mm-hmm. And everybody knows in the deepest part of their heart that we're way better than that.
Mm-hmm. We have an economic and political system which is structuring for stupidity. The idea of news, that sort of our sense of the way the world is just comes through news. Well, of course it doesn't. Corporations are the biggest storytellers in our lives. The price of a product is a story. The way we're told we need to buy this or that, this is all stories. All those stories are based on the hydrocarbon civilization, cheap oil and not caring about the atmosphere. So when I talk about collapse, it's as much a collapse of all that worldview, all that structure. So the money system, the advertising system, the fact that we need to consume stuff in order to have jobs, in order to pay bills, that's what's going to fall apart. And some people would say it should fall apart to help. I don't know if that's better. I just think that's just speculation, whether it's better to have a collapse of industrial consumer society now or not. I think there'll be a hell of a lot of suffering in any rapid change. So rather than making predictions, I just say that we need to recognize how deep it goes, the predicament. How do we get into this predicament? We need to look and inquire deeply and make sure we don't repeat the same problems in our responses to this situation.
How much energy are we going to spend talking to younger generations or each other, pretending like things aren't what they are? Let's just admit the truth and then behave accordingly. We are absolutely morally obliged to try to save as much as we can and mitigate and buy ourselves time. If there's one tiny organism in the Amazon that gets to live one more week, then it's worth it.
Does that mean that we can't feel joy? No. Or that we can't feel love? I mean, I love the Jonathan Franzen quote, even in a world of dying, there are new loves being born. You pay a price for it. It comes with sadness for sure. And I don't see any way around it. I, as someone who shares Dharma sessions with people, I've looked also for those kinds of perspectives, and I cannot honestly offer any that alleviate the sadness. I can't bear any kind of transcendent talk that is rife in the spiritual scenes. It's just another form of denial and some sort of crazy bargaining that doesn't work. It's rough. It's like Van Morrison said, rough God goes riding. This is a rough ride, and we're watching a lot of very sad things, you know.
That's okay. That's normal to be confused and to feel pain in this context, and learn how to hold each other in that, and in that calmer way then start to explore, so what do we do, or what do we stop doing? Because I realize a lot of people would just want quick solutions, like, oh no, okay, what do we do, where do we run, who do we blame, who do we fight, is that kind of reaction. And so I wanted to help create something that invites a different way of being. And one Outback pilot, she told me, yeah, you're talking about extending the glide. You know.
I love this analogy.
And,
go on, yeah.
And she said, well, yeah, like if your engine cuts out, you've got problems, your first thing to do is extend the glide, because you're two things, you know, you might suddenly, gives you time to maybe kickstart the engines or solve whatever technical problem you've got, or you're also trying to look for a safer place to land. And then maybe the third thing is to give yourself time to, if you can't call home and say goodbye, just process and say thank you, have some gratitude for the experience of your life.